When my mom called to tell me she had stage 4 cancer, she didn't cry or ask for sympathy. "It's bad," she said flatly. "You're coming home, right?" No plea, no softness, just a demand. That was Deborah for you. Even cancer couldn't chip away her edges. I packed up my life in Chicago and drove back to my childhood home in Pennsylvania, a cookie-cutter suburb where nothing ever changed. The house was exactly as I remembered, pristine, lifeless, suffocating. My mother had always kept it spotless, like messes weren't allowed, even emotional ones. Paul opened the door. "Hey, kiddo," he said with a tired smile, pulling me into a hug. I stiffened in his arms, his warmth throwing me off. Paul wasn't a stranger. We'd been family for 8 years, but he still felt like an outsider in the story of my life. "You holding up?" he asked, his hazel eyes full of worry. I shrugged. Guess I don't have a choice. Neither did he, I thought. Deborah ruled over us, like a queen on her throne. Even now, she was calling the shots, snapping at doctors and barking orders from her hospital bed. Paul and I spent our days orbiting around her needs, offering her what she demanded and getting nothing in return. The first few weeks blurred together. Hospital visits, bills piling up, awkward silences around the house. At night, Paul and I sat in the living room, nursing beers and watching reruns, trying to distract ourselves from the tension. He was polite, as always, but there was something different about him now. He looked worn out, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his back. One night, I asked, "How are you holding up?" He laughed dryly. "Honestly, I don't even know anymore." For the first time, I saw the cracks in his perfect husband facade. He talked about how hard it was to keep everything together, how Deborah's sharp tongue cut him deeper than she realized. "She wasn't always like this," he said softly. "She used to be different, happier." I didn't know what to say. I'd never seen that version of her, the one he clearly still loved. Things shifted after that. Paul and I started spending more time together, not intentionally at first, but it became easier to confide in him than to sit alone with my thoughts. We'd joke about Deborah's impossible demands, commiserating like old friends. But one night, the joking stopped. I found him in the garage, sitting on the workbench, his head in his hands. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he admitted, his voice raw. Without thinking, I put a hand on his shoulder. It was meant to comfort him, but when he looked up, something passed between us. "Laura," his voice was barely a whisper. I should have pulled away. I should have walked out. But I didn't. When he kissed me, it wasn't planned or even passionate. It was hesitant, almost desperate, like he was reaching for something solid to hold on to. I kissed him back, ignoring the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong. When it was over, he stepped back, his eyes wide with guilt. "We can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. I nodded, but deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't the end. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, something we'd both pretend never happened. But mistakes don't happen twice unless you let them. The second time happened just days later. Deborah was still in the hospital, and Paul and I were left to maintain the house together. We spent our evenings in strained companionship, falling into a routine of shared meals and late-night conversations. At first, it felt innocent, two people trying to survive the same storm. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One night, after dinner, we sat on the couch with a bottle of wine between us. It was the kind of wine Deborah used to like, though she hadn't touched a glass in years. Paul poured me a second glass, then a third. We started talking, really talking about her, about us, about how life had become a relentless grind of caregiving and guilt. "She's always been hard on you," Paul said, his voice soft. "I see it. She demands so much from you, from everyone. I don't think she knows how to let people in." I nodded, staring into my glass.
"She's always been like that."
"I don't think she's ever really loved anyone, not even me." Paul's face darkened. "That's not true," he said quietly. "She loves you. She just doesn't know how to show it." I laughed bitterly. Maybe. Or maybe she's just too broken to care about anyone but herself. Paul didn't respond, but the look in his eyes made my chest tighten. I knew he was thinking the same thing about himself. That night, we didn't make excuses. When he kissed me, I didn't pull away. When his hands found mine, I didn't stop him. It wasn't about love or lust. It was about finding something that felt real in a life that had become unbearably hollow. Afterward, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on both of us. "This can't happen again," he said, his voice shaky. I nodded, but we both knew it was a lie. Deborah came home a week later. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. We moved her into the living room, where she could be surrounded by family, though she spent most of her time asleep or issuing sharp commands from her hospital bed. "Laura, make sure the sheets are tucked in tighter. Paul, turn off the damn TV. I can hear it all the way in here. Are either of you actually paying attention, or do I need to do everything myself?" Her voice grated on me, but I forced a smile, pretending her words didn't feel like knives. Paul pretended too, but at night, when the house was dark and silent, we found each other. We were careful, so careful, but it was impossible to hide everything. Deborah wasn't stupid, and neither were the people around her. One night, as I crept back to my room, Deborah's voice stopped me. "Laura." I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding.
What?
"Come here." I stepped into the living room, where she sat propped up in bed, her face pale and drawn. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Do you think I don't see what's going on between you and Paul?" The blood drained from my face. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. She smiled faintly, bitterly. "Don't play dumb. You're not as good at it as you think." I opened my mouth to protest, but she cut me off. "Let me tell you something," she said, her voice low and cold. "Men like Paul, they'll make you feel special for a while, but they always leave in the end. Just like your father did." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in years, I didn't have a response. "Go to bed," she said, waving me off. "And think about what kind of person you want to be when I'm gone." I obeyed, but I didn't sleep that night. Deborah's return home shifted the dynamic in the house. Paul and I moved through the days like actors in a play, performing the roles of the dutiful husband and daughter, while the truth of what we'd become simmered beneath the surface. Deborah, even in her weakened state, seemed sharper than ever, her eyes watching us with a suspicion that grew harder to ignore. "Laura, where were you last night?" she asked one morning, her tone casual but pointed. "I was in my room," I lied, keeping my back to her as I poured coffee. "Strange," she murmured. "I thought I heard footsteps in the hall." And Paul's door creaking open. The mug nearly slipped from my hand. I forced a laugh, turning to face her. "You must have been dreaming." She smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe," but I could tell she didn't believe me. The walls of the house began to close in. Every glance from Deborah felt like an accusation, every silence heavy with unspoken truths. Paul and I became more careful, more distant, but the distance only made the pull between us stronger. One night, as we stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, his hand brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, but it set my skin on fire. "We have to stop this," he said under his breath, his voice barely audible over the running water. "I know," I whispered back, though the words felt like a lie. But when he looked at me, the weariness in his eyes, the longing, it was enough to undo me. Deborah coughed from the living room, a harsh, rattling sound that broke the spell. We stepped apart, guilt flooding the space between us. The pressure built with every passing day. Margaret, an old family friend, began stopping by more frequently to help with Deborah's care. She was chatty, warm, and deeply nosy. "Laura, you've been spending a lot of time with Paul, haven't you?" she asked one afternoon as we folded laundry together. "He's family," I said, keeping my voice light. She gave me a sidelong glance.
Sure.
"But don't you think it's unusual, the way you two are always together?" My hand stilled on the bedsheet I was folding. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you don't." She didn't press further, but the implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Deborah's health declined rapidly. Hospice nurses came and went, their faces sympathetic but detached. The house felt more like a waiting room than a home, and the inevitability of her death loomed over us like a storm cloud. One evening, as I sat by her bedside, she reached out and grabbed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Laura," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "When this is over, you'll have to figure out who you are without me." Without him? I froze. "What are you talking about?" She gave me a sad smile. "You think I don't see what's happening? You think I don't know?" My chest tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Mom, you're imagining things." "No," she interrupted, her voice sharp despite her weakness. "I'm not. And I don't need you to confess. I just need you to stop lying to yourself." Her words cut deeper than any accusation could. I sat there, stunned, as she closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep, leaving me alone with the truth I could no longer deny. Late that night, I found Paul in the garage. He was sitting on the workbench, his head in his hands, the same way he'd been the first time we kissed. "She knows," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, his face pale.
"What?"
"She knows about us. Or she suspects. Either way, she's not stupid." Paul stood, running a hand through his hair. "We need to stop," he said, his voice strained. "Before this gets any worse." "It's already worse," I shot back, the frustration spilling out of me. "It's been worse from the beginning." He sighed heavily, leaning against the workbench. "This isn't who I want to be, Laura." "Then who do you want to be?" I demanded, my voice rising. "The perfect husband? The grieving widower? Do you even know?" He didn't answer, and the silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him admit that he needed me as much as I needed him. But instead, I turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the garage. Deborah's words haunted me for the rest of the night. I replayed them over and over, wondering how much she knew, how much she had guessed. And for the first time, I started to wonder if she was right, if I was lying to myself about who I was, about what I wanted, about everything. But the truth was too painful to face. So I buried it, just like I buried everything else. The house felt heavier each day, as though the secrets we carried were pressing against the walls, threatening to collapse them. Deborah was fading quickly now, her sharp tongue softened by exhaustion but her eyes still sharp enough to pierce through me. Paul and I avoided being alone together whenever we could, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. I thought I could keep everything under control, keep Deborah's suspicions at bay. But as always, she was one step ahead. It happened during one of her rare lucid afternoons. The hospice nurse had just left, and Margaret was in the kitchen making tea. Paul and I were in the living room, rearranging Deborah's medications while she lay propped up in bed, watching us with that hawk-like gaze of hers. "You two look like a married couple," she said suddenly. Paul froze, his hand hovering over a bottle of pills. "Mom." "Stop," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. Her lips curved into a faint smile.
"Why?"
"Does the truth make you uncomfortable?" Paul cleared his throat, stepping back. "Deborah, that's enough. You're tired." "I'm dying," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Not tired. Let's not pretend otherwise." She turned her attention back to me, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think I don't see what's going on between you two?" The room went silent. My stomach twisted into knots as Paul looked at me, panic flickering across his face. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, forcing a laugh. She chuckled darkly. "Of course you don't. But let me give you some advice, Laura. Men like Paul don't save you. They destroy you. And when they're done, they move on to the next thing." "Deborah, stop," Paul said, his voice low but firm. She ignored him, her gaze locked on mine. "You're not special, Laura. Don't fool yourself into thinking you are." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but I couldn't find the words to respond. "Mom, you don't know anything," I finally said, my voice trembling. Her smile widened, cold and triumphant. "Don't I?" Later that night, I found Paul in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low.
He didn't look at me.
What's there to talk about? She knows, I said, stepping closer. And if she doesn't know everything, she's close enough. Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe this is a sign. We should stop. No, I interrupted, my voice shaking. You don't get to do that. You don't get to act like this was all my fault. You wanted this as much as I did. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with guilt and something else I couldn't quite name. I know, he said quietly, but that doesn't make it right. Nothing about this situation is right, I snapped. But that doesn't mean I can just walk away. Paul set his glass down, his shoulders slumping. Laura, this is to end. Before it destroys us both. I wanted to scream at him, to beg him to stay, to tell him I couldn't do this alone. But instead, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the kitchen with the weight of our choices hanging between us. The next morning, Deborah called me into her room. She looked smaller than ever, her skin pale and paper-thin, her breathing shallow. Sit, she said, gesturing to the chair beside her bed. I sat down, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. I want you to promise me something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
What?
I asked, my throat tight. When I'm gone, don't let this ruin you, she said, her eyes boring into mine. You think you're in control, but you're not. And if you're not careful, you're going to lose yourself. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do, she said firmly. You've always been too much like me, stubborn, selfish, always looking for a fight. But this isn't a fight you can win. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. I'll be fine, I said, my voice trembling. She smiled faintly. I hope so. Her words stayed with me long after I left the room, echoing in my mind like a warning I didn't want to hear. Paul avoided me for the rest of the day, his silence a weight I couldn't escape. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to step back or let myself fall. The night Deborah died was eerily quiet. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old house seemed to hold their breath. Paul and I had spent the day tending to her, taking turns wiping her forehead and adjusting her blankets as the hospice nurse murmured assurances that the end was near. By evening, the nurse left and it was just the three of us. I sat by her bedside, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallow and uneven. Paul stood near the window, his back to us, staring out into the darkness. She's waiting, the nurse had said before she left. Sometimes they hold on until they feel like it's okay to let go. Around midnight, Deborah's breathing changed, slower, raspier, like each breath was a battle. I squeezed her hand, leaning closer. It's okay, Mom, I whispered. You can rest now. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. But then she exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and didn't take another. I sat frozen, staring at her still face, waiting for some sign that I was wrong. But none came. She's gone, I said, my voice barely audible. Paul turned from the window, his face pale. He crossed the room and placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch both grounding and unbearable. I'll call the nurse, he said softly. I nodded, unable to look at him. The hours that followed were a blur. The nurse returned, offering condolences and instructions. The funeral home was called. Papers were signed. By the time the house was empty again, the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale, gray light through the windows. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where Deborah's hospital bed had been just hours earlier. The room felt empty in a way I couldn't explain, like the air itself had been sucked out. Paul sat down next to me, close but not touching. How are you holding up? He asked after a long silence. I turned to him, anger flaring in my chest. Don't ask me that, I snapped. You don't get to ask me that. He looked taken aback, but didn't respond. You think I don't know what you're doing? I continued, my voice rising. You're trying to pretend like we're just two people grieving, like this thing between us doesn't exist. Laura, stop, he said quietly. No, I said, standing up. I won't stop. She's gone now, so what happens next? Do we just go back to pretending like none of this ever happened? Or do you finally admit that you used me? His jaw tightened, and he stood, his eyes hard. I didn't use you, he said firmly. And you know that. Do I? I shot back, tears burning in my eyes. Because right now, it feels like you're already pulling away, just like she said you would. Your mother was bitter and angry, and she wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice rising. Don't let her poison you now that she's gone. Maybe she was right, I said, my voice breaking. Maybe I was just a distraction for you. Something to make you feel better while your perfect little world fell apart. His face softened, the anger fading. You weren't a distraction, he said quietly. You were everything. For a moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let him hold me, to let myself drown in him one last time. But something inside me refused. Then why does it feel like this is already over? I asked, my voice trembling. Paul didn't answer. We didn't speak for the rest of the day. Paul disappeared into the garage, and I spent hours pacing the house, haunted by the echoes of my mother's voice and the weight of her final words. By the time the funeral was over, the distance between us had become insurmountable. Paul was polite, attentive, and distant, like a switch had flipped inside him. He smiled for the guests, thanked them for their condolences, and avoided my gaze entirely. A week after the funeral, I packed my bags. Paul found me in my room, folding the last of my clothes into a suitcase. You don't have to go, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Yes, I do, I replied without looking at him. He was silent for a long moment. Where will you go? I don't know yet, I admitted. But I can't stay here. Laura, his voice trailed off, and when I finally looked at him, I saw the same guilt and longing that had haunted us from the beginning. I can't keep pretending, Paul, I said, my voice breaking. I need to figure out who I am without you. Without her. He nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. I hope you find what you're looking for. I wanted to say something more, something final, but the words wouldn't come. So I zipped up my suitcase, picked it up, and walked out of the room. As I reached the front door, I turned back one last time. Paul was standing at the base of the stairs, his hands shoved in his pockets, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Goodbye, Paul, I said softly. Goodbye, Laura, he replied. And then I walked out, leaving him and everything else behind. 2 years later, the house still haunts me, though I haven't stepped inside since the day I left. It lingers in my dreams, its rooms steeped in silence, its walls heavy with the secrets we tried to bury. Paul remarried last year. I saw the announcement on Facebook, a candid photo of him and his new wife, Emily, laughing under a canopy of string lights. She looks kind, with soft brown hair and a warm smile, the kind of woman who probably folds laundry while humming to herself. The post was flooded with comments congratulating him on finding happiness again. I didn't react, didn't even linger on the page. But the ache in my chest stayed for days. After I left, I drifted for a while, living out of motels and cheap apartments, picking up temp jobs to keep myself afloat. Therapy came later, after a breakdown in the middle of a grocery store parking lot left me shaking and gasping for air. It sounds like you're carrying a lot of guilt, my therapist, Dr. Morgan, said during our first session. I laughed bitterly. Guilt doesn't even begin to cover it. She nodded, her pen hovering over her notepad. Tell me about your mother. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't spoken about Deborah since the funeral. I'd shoved her into the darkest corners of my mind, hoping the memories would fade if I ignored them long enough. She was complicated, I said finally. Dr. Morgan tilted her head, waiting. She was controlling. Harsh. Nothing I ever did was good enough for her. But she wasn't always like that. Paul said she used to be happier, softer. I never saw that side of her. And Paul... I hesitated, my throat tightening. He was supposed to be her rock, her support. And instead, my voice trailed off. Dr. Morgan leaned forward slightly. Instead, he became something else. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. What happened between you and Paul, Laura? The question hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. For the first time, I told the story, the whole story, letting the words tumble out in a rush of guilt and anger and sadness. When I finished, Dr. Morgan was silent for a long moment. "It sounds like you were searching for something," she said finally. "Connection, validation, maybe even love. But in a situation like that, it was always going to be complicated." Complicated, I repeated bitterly. That's one way to put it. The hardest part wasn't the guilt. It was the longing. I missed him. Not just the way he looked at me, or the way he made me feel, but the way we understood each other in a way no one else did. It was twisted and wrong, but it was real. And for a while, it was all I had. But as the months passed, I began to see it for what it was, a desperate attempt to fill the void my mother had left in both of us. Paul wasn't my savior, and I wasn't his. We were just two broken people grasping at each other in the dark. Last week, I visited my mother's grave for the first time since the funeral. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day she would have hated. "Deborah always preferred the rain. It makes the world quieter," she used to say. Her name was etched into the marble headstone, simple and elegant. Deborah and Foster. Beloved mother and wife, ***. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to say. Finally, I crouched down, brushing a stray leaf off the base of the headstone. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "For everything. For not being the daughter you wanted. For hating you. For letting it get so far." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying my words away. "I don't know who I am yet," I continued, my voice shaking. "But I'm trying. I promise I'm trying." For the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though I'd finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying. When I left the cemetery, I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I felt like I could move forward. Paul is a ghost now, just like Deborah. A part of my past that will always linger, but no longer define me. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for what I did. But maybe forgiveness isn't the point. Maybe survival is enough.